They came from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, from Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Italy, from Greece, Ukraine, Russia, and China. For more than 300 years, Pittsburgh attracted millions of immigrants hoping for a better life in the New World. They built this city with iron, coal, glass, and steel. And all the while they held the memory of their homelands in their hearts, passing on their heritage to their children and grandchildren. Perhaps more than any other city, Pittsburgh embodies the American mosaic. The collection of cultures that make up this city are celebrated in one of the world's most unique expressions of ethnic pride, the Nationality classrooms at the University of Pittsburgh. At the end of World War I, the University of Pittsburgh was a hillside collection of buildings, some pre-war neoclassical from a failed Acropolis plan, and others leftover wooden barracks. The university itself was operating at a deficit, and worse, with very little community support. The industry that had built the city and the education that could define its future existed in two distinct and separate worlds. In 1921, John Gabbert Bowman came to the university as its 10th chancellor. He faced the challenge of revitalizing the university, making it worthy of this new dynamic city. He needed classroom and office space to accommodate a growing enrollment, and he needed the support of an indifferent public to make these things happen. It would be a monumental struggle. Just below the university was this 14-acre plot called Frick Acres, with a few Victorian homes and truck gardens. Each spring, the traveling circuses would pitch their tents and entertain the townspeople. Bowman passed this land every day on his walk to the office. Gradually, a picture formed in his mind, a soaring tower, a high building that would anchor the university and symbolize the ideal of higher education. He knew that a skyscraper would put the university on the map. But to accomplish this lofty and expensive goal, he'd need the backing not only of the powerful captains of industry, which would be hard enough, but of the working classes as well. The smoky city, the Birmingham of America, hell with the lid off. Pittsburgh in the 20s was a wonder of modern industry. Miles of mills lined the rivers. Tons of steel were shipped to the far reaches of the earth. Immigrant labor was the life force of the steel industry. But what did the outmoded, debt-ridden university mean to the mill workers and bosses? Bowman visited the mills to find the answer, and he heard the same response again and again. A college is no good to business. This was a revelation. And Bowman knew he must somehow awaken in these people the realization that through education, their children could achieve the American dream that had brought them here. They could become metallurgists and engineers, physicians, teachers, and poets. Bowman needed a plan that could capture the imagination of the mill-toughened people and make them allies in his battle to resurrect and rebuild the University of Pittsburgh. Gradually, he formed the idea of somehow incorporating into the new tower all the good things the immigrants had brought to America. In 1925, Bowman spent an evening with Duquesne mill workers and their families. He told them of his dream to create special classrooms as tributes to the people who came from abroad to help build Pittsburgh. Their children and grandchildren, he told them, could learn to shape the future in a setting that would celebrate their past. A woman rose with a baby in her arms. "We got no money," she said, "but we go without meat for a week and give you that." Then a man rose, saying, "I wear this suit for another year and give you the money." Soon pledges were pouring in from the crowd. When he left the hall, Bowman found the Duquesne fire engine waiting. The fire chief said, "You will meet obstacles. We want to show you how to go through red lights." With siren wailing and bells clanging, the red truck transported Bowman along the Mon River and through Pittsburgh to his home in Oakland. For Bowman, it was an exhilarating first step. A few days later, Bowman spoke with Ruth Crawford Mitchell, a young lecturer in sociology. He told her of his idea, and at that meeting, the Nationality Room's program was born. They set up principles to govern the program. To capture enduring values, they decided that the style of each room should predate 1787, the founding date of the University of Pittsburgh and the year the United States Constitution was adopted. The design must emphasize cultural and aesthetic roots. They would allow no political symbols or portraits of living persons in those rooms. And they decided that only those national groups from countries recognized by the U.S. Department of State would be eligible for space in the tower. This rule would later be challenged. Mrs. Mitchell sounded the call to the communities. In 1926, 2 months after ground was broken for the tower, Greek students at the university met informally to discuss the idea. On February 8, 1927, the first official Nationality Room committee met. The Italians, at that time the largest foreign-born group in Pittsburgh, held the first formal committee meeting. Before long, there were 17 nationality committees working together to plan their rooms. It was as if the concept of the American melting pot had come of age. Old ethnic rivalries were set aside. New unions were formed. Representatives from the Slovenian, Serbian, and Croatian communities joined together to create a room commemorating their new country, Yugoslavia. The idea struck a responsive chord abroad as well, where counterpart committees were formed in Dublin, Athens, Beijing, and Budapest. Each committee faced 2 difficult tasks. First, to decide which elements of their cultural heritage to portray in the design of the classroom, and then to raise enough money to build it. For some committees, fundraising was the easy part. They held picnics, bake sales, and festivals. There were benefit performances of traditional folk dances. The proceeds of Serbian Day at Kennywood Park were donated to the Yugoslav Room Fund for 16 years. The small French community raised the money for their room by holding a series of Mardi Gras balls, with a cruise on the SS Normandy as the grand prize. Mrs. Mitchell and committee members traveled abroad to conduct research and negotiations. And in many cases, foreign governments held design competitions and offered money, materials, and the services of architects and artists. Within a year, the German committee had raised most of the funds needed. So had the Romanians. For other groups, it would be a steeper climb. But their commitment kept them going, and dollar by dollar, the funds grew. The last rivet on the tower's steelwork was driven on October 21st, 1929. 8 days later, the stock market crashed. Fundraising had been difficult enough in the best of times. Now it became a desperate challenge. The funds the Romanian committee had so easily collected were nearly wiped out by bank foreclosures. The Depression wasn't the only obstacle. In 1929, the Chinese government pledged $10,000 in gold to help build the Chinese classroom. But war in China delayed the payment. Undaunted, the Chinese committee sent Cornelia Nellie Quill on a 3-month journey across America to rice merchants in New York, tea merchants in Boston, and laundry associations in Chicago. And she raised the money. The Chinese government finally made good their pledge in 1935. Chancellor Bowman was facing his own money problems. The Depression brought construction of the Great Tower to a halt in 1930 with only half the stonework completed. But Bowman appealed again to the people of Pittsburgh, and gradually donations trickled in again. Foot by foot, The steel frame was covered with Indiana limestone. As fundraising progressed in Pittsburgh, designs for the Nationality rooms evolved. Artists prepared mountains of drawings. One by one, the designs were approved, and by 1937, with the new Cathedral of Learning nearly completed, construction on the Nationality classrooms began. Artists and craftsmen from around the world converged on Pittsburgh to bring the architect's plans to life. Athenian artist Demetrius Kokotzis came to hand-paint the marble and coffered ceiling of the Greek room with earth colors and beeswax, overlaid with 22-karat gold leaf, rubbed on with polishing bones. It took him 7 months and 7 days. Polish artists, the Szymborskis, came from Krakow to decorate the ornate ceiling of the Polish room. Mrs. Mitchell brought them 12 eggs each morning so they could mix their traditional tempera paint. Karol and Marie Zwolinski arrived from Prague to paint the murals and decorate the ceiling beams of the Czechoslovak room with botanically accurate flowers and plants. Step by step, piece by piece, each portrait of a people began to emerge. The committees abroad were busy too, scouting out rare materials, collecting artifacts, and commissioning decorative works for the rooms. Meanwhile, the Syria and Lebanese communities had joined forces to build a room commemorating their Arab culture. They learned that a complete antique library from a Damascus home was on display at a New York art gallery and began negotiations to acquire the room. It would take 2 years for the parties to reach an agreement. As the shadow of war swept over Europe, the committees raced against time to complete these expressions of national unity and pride. In 1938, the first 5 rooms were finished, and the visions of many dedicated people over a decade were finally realized. Mother Russia comes alive in the Russian room, through Byzantine influences and ancient folk motifs that pervade Russian art. The German room, based in part on the great aula of the University of Heidelberg, is brightened by characters from the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. The Swedish room, its walls and sloped ceiling vibrant with murals and flower painting in the style of the 18th century folk artist Gustav Reuter. The Scottish room heralds the spirit of freedom which rang through the great halls and castles of the 17th century, the period when Scotland was least influenced by the outside world. And the early American room, commissioned by a university trustee to commemorate the simple, sturdy life of the earliest European settlers in New England. Each room was dedicated in a formal ceremony in the Commons Room of the Cathedral of Learning. Foreign clergy and dignitaries came to participate in the services. The following year, 1939, 4 more rooms were completed. The Yugoslav room, where scholars represent the merging of the cultures of the Eastern Empire, Byzantium, and the Western Empire, Rome. The Chinese room, in 18th century imperial style, inspired by the palace in Peking's Forbidden City, pays tribute to Confucian ideals of a democratic education. The Hungarian room traces the millennia-long history of the Magyar culture and folk traditions in a design warm with paprika red. The Czechoslovak room celebrates a new nation emerging from an epic history, accented by flowers and plants from the Czech meadows and Slovak mountain valleys. At the Czechoslovak room's dedication in 1939, with the enemy poised to invade his country, Jan Masaryk, son of President Masaryk and one-time foreign minister, spoke these words.
How proud I was this morning to walk into this cathedral of learning, where I have seen rooms belonging to many nations, and where I saw proud American children of parentage of these countries, imbibing the free, unbiased truth of learning. I'm going to pray to God tonight that Europe someday will be like that we shall be men and women of this or that nationality, or parentage, or race, or creed, but working together for the common good of ourselves and those who come after us.
With England under attack, plans for the English room were delayed. In Krakow, many of the professors on the Polish room committee were sent to concentration camps. Communications with the Romanian committee in Bucharest were cut off, but still, the work went on. In Krakow, the metal artist completed the replica of the Jagiellonian globe, enlarged from the 16th century original. The painting of Copernicus was finished in 1939 and shipped to America on the last trip of the MS Batory as Poland was invaded. When the portrait arrived, the Polish room, inspired by rooms in Krakow's Wawel Castle, was complete. A few months later, the Lithuanian room was dedicated. Its style pays tribute to nature and a commitment to home and homeland through traditional Lithuanian folk art. In 1940, the marble columns for the Greek room were finally finished and loaded on one of the last ships to leave the Mediterranean before Greece was occupied by the enemy. With communications cut, architect John Trevelos could only pray that the marble arrived safely. In November 1941, listening secretly to the BBC on his illegal radio in Athens, he heard a broadcast of the Pittsburgh dedication of the Greek room, and he knew his prayers had been answered. As France was being invaded, a sculptor carved the coat of arms of a free French republic above the door of the Empire-style French room, and the room was completed. It was a ray of hope in dark times. Meanwhile, the Syria-Lebanon Committee had acquired the antique Damascus Library, and it was reassembled in its permanent place in the Cathedral of Learning. The room dates from 1782, and it remains the only original historic room of all the Nationality classrooms. The Romanian Committee, which had suffered financial troubles in 1929, found an ingenious way around the deadlock of war. They petitioned the government for custody of the marble, iron gates, and mosaic from the Romanian pavilion of the New York World's Fair, and completed their room based on a 17th century Orthodox monastery. war was finally over. Much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. But the spirit of ethnic pride that had sustained the work on the nationality rooms during the war inspired new effort with the advent of peace. And before long, more classrooms were finished. The Norwegian room, inspired by a traditional farmhouse, recalls the long winters in the land of the midnight sun. The Italian room, based on a 15th century Tuscan monastery, celebrates Italian art, music, and religion, and honors the first woman in the world to earn a university degree. The English Committee had selected a Tudor design for its room, but the war had brought all plans to a standstill. After the war, with much of London in ruins, the chairman of the Room Committee in London, Lord Alfred Bosson, received permission to scour the rubble of the House of Commons for salvageable artifacts. Today, there is more original material from the House of Commons in the Tudor Gothic English Room at the University of Pittsburgh than there is in London. Finally, in 1957, the last of the original nationality classrooms was dedicated. The Irish Room celebrates the golden age of Ireland in the 6th century Romanesque style of a monk's oratory. "18 rooms, 18 cultures, 18 transplanted homelands, 18 classrooms that teach." The Nationality Rooms program, conceived by Chancellor Bowman and Ruth Crawford Mitchell, was a complete success. Students were learning Greek in the serene setting of the Greek room, history in the glorious Chinese room, mathematics in the German room. The city that was built at a geographical confluence now had at its center a monument to education that was itself a confluence of cultures. The Nationality Rooms program was designed to be dynamic, to reflect the changing character of our country, encouraging other nationality groups to build new classrooms. But after Mrs. Mitchell's retirement and the dedication of the Irish Room in 1957, 8 years went by with no new room initiatives. In 1965, in the midst of a changing world and turbulent times, a new director arrived. E. Maxine Bruns had just returned from 15 years of residence in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. She saw that the original Nationality Room principle, requiring nations to be recognized by the U.S. Department of State, was denying many ethnic groups the privilege of creating their own rooms. A broader definition of nationality paved the way for the creation of new rooms depicting the cultural history of peoples whose traditional territory and way of life may not coincide with political boundaries. To date, 4 new rooms have been added, and others are well underway. Pittsburgh's African American community chose to represent their cultures through an Asante Temple courtyard, incorporating the arts, science, music, and languages of Africa's ancient kingdoms. The Armenian Room, commemorating the world's first Christian nation, is inspired by the library in Sanahin Monastery, built in the 10th to 12th centuries. A first-century stone dwelling in the Galilee was the model for the Israel Heritage Room. The agricultural society which the Jews established there is reflected in the artifacts spanning more than 2,000 years. The Ukrainian Room recreates an area where a nobleman would have received guests. The intricate metalwork traces Ukrainian culture to its 17th century Renaissance. Construction of the Austrian Room is now underway. Its 18th century Baroque style reflects the zenith of the Austrian Empire under the Habsburgs. As new nations with ancient heritages are formed, an American consciousness of our ethnic origins deepens, other rooms will be built. Each room will be a unique expression of the common values that brought us to these shores. It's difficult to measure the impact these rooms have had. A single hand-carved chair or stained glass portrait may spark ideas that would otherwise lay untapped. A steady stream of people come to visit the now world-famous rooms. Members of Quo Vadis, a volunteer student organization, study the rooms in great detail and conduct guided tours for nearly 50,000 visitors every year. But the success of the program goes beyond the classrooms themselves. After completing the first Nationality rooms, the committees chose to remain together and channel their efforts in new ways to promote intercultural exchange. They sponsor lectures, concerts, exhibits, and other events, and so far they have provided more than 500 scholarships for university students and faculty to study abroad. The story of the Nationality rooms at the University of Pittsburgh is a history of our century, of the migration of peoples, of the strife of war, of changing political boundaries, and of the triumph of the human spirit. These radiant expressions of cultural pride spring from cooperation, determination, inspiration, and most of all, the love of learning. For these rooms are not meant to be mere static windows to another time and place, but rather rich cultural gardens where ideas of the future take root and where the descendants of those early immigrants come to learn. Alan McGee Scaife, former president of the Board of Trustees, wrote of these rooms.
Here, people with their own hands, out of their own finest intelligence and deepest spiritual concepts, working together, have built into a great university fresh strength and perennial hope that all men, in the joy of striving after learning, may reach the highest wisdom and the greatest good for all.